The Kennedys are a family famed for charisma, ambition, and political legacy. Among them is Rosemary Kennedy, the sister history nearly forgot. Born into America's most storied dynasty, she appeared in early photographs, smiling alongside her brothers, John, Robert, and Ted. She was destined, it seemed, for a charmed life. But behind the genteel smiles and debutante gowns was a young woman struggling against forces she could not control, in an era that offered few answers and even less compassion. Rosemary's developmental challenges, once seen as a family embarrassment, led to a secret medical procedure that silenced her for the rest of her life. Yet in that silence, she would become a quiet catalyst for change. Her story, long hidden, is one of heartbreak and injustice, but also of unexpected impact. Through her, the Kennedy family confronted painful truths and helped spark a global movement for disability rights and inclusion. This video explores the life of Rosemary Kennedy, her early promise, her tragic fate, and the legacy she never knew she would leave behind. In the crisp September air of 1918, as the world reeled from the closing days of the First World War and the deadly grip of the Spanish flu pandemic, Rosemary Kennedy entered the world in Brookline, Massachusetts. As the third child of Joseph P. Kennedy Sr. and Rose Fitzgerald Kennedy, she was born into a rising American dynasty. Her father, a wealthy, driven financier, harbored political ambitions that would shape the lives of all his children. Her mother, a devout Catholic and daughter of Boston's mayor, embodied poise and discipline. But from the very beginning, something was different about their daughter, Rosemary. Her beginnings were chaotic, starting with a traumatic birth. The attending physician was late, and in an effort to delay delivery, the nurse reportedly instructed Rose Kennedy to keep her legs closed while she physically held the baby in the birth canal. It's now believed that this may have cut off oxygen to Rosemary's brain, potentially causing the cognitive impairments that became apparent as she grew. As a young child, Rosemary was sweet, affectionate, and eager to please, with large brown eyes and a gentle demeanor. But compared to her brilliant, energetic siblings, Joe Jr., John, and Kathleen, she was slower to walk, to talk, and to master basic skills. Her mother, Rose, took pains to hide this, insisting on presenting the image of a perfect, high-achieving family. Rosemary's delays were noted, but rarely discussed outside the home. When she reached school age, Rosemary was enrolled in elite Catholic convent schools, but the structured curriculum proved overwhelming. Teachers noticed she couldn't keep pace. Her handwriting was uncertain, and reading was a challenge. But she was obedient, always trying her best. At times, Rose would homeschool her privately, crafting personalized lessons and hoping sheer discipline and repetition would close the gap. And for brief moments, Rosemary flourished. She loved music, dancing, and going to the theater. She wrote sweet, heartfelt letters to family members and looked forward to social events. When Joe Kennedy Sr. was appointed ambassador to the United Kingdom in 1938, Rosemary joined her siblings in London. Photographs from the time show her smiling beside her sisters at royal balls and diplomatic events. Yet behind the elegance lay a growing crisis. Rosemary's developmental issues were worsening, and she was beginning to rebel against the strict, controlling expectations placed on her. She began sneaking out of the house at night, disappearing for hours, wandering the streets or socializing with strangers, which, frankly, sounds like the normal behavior of a rebellious teenager. However, her parents, especially Joe, feared not only for her safety, but for the reputation of the Kennedy name. In a society that pathologized female sexuality and treated mental illness as a source of shame, the Kennedys were desperate to maintain the illusion of normalcy. Their ambition for power left no room for public vulnerability. In this tension, between a pathological father's obsession with control, a mother's quiet devotion, and a daughter's yearning to be loved and understood, Rosemary's fate was sealed without her even knowing it. The family had long shielded her with silence and euphemism. Her difficulties were described as a slowness or shyness, and when the Kennedy children were introduced at social events, Rosemary was presented with deliberate choreography. She was told to smile, say little, and was always accompanied. But beneath that polished surface, her emotional and cognitive challenges were growing more difficult to manage. Her letters home were filled with warmth, but often disorganized or repetitive. Her school performance remained far below her siblings' towering achievements, despite an ever-rotating cast of tutors and special programs. She was often frustrated, aware of her limitations, and the constant comparisons to her siblings only deepened her pain. As puberty took hold, Rosemary's behavior began to shift in unpredictable and alarming ways. She experienced intense mood swings, periods of blank withdrawal, followed by bursts of agitation or impulsivity. Sometimes she was sweet and compliant, other times sullen or defiant. Her once cooperative demeanor was being replaced with something her parents did not understand and deeply feared. Most distressing to the Kennedys was Rosemary's growing sexual curiosity. She began sneaking out of convent schools at night, wandering unsupervised and meeting with boys. There were whispers, unconfirmed it must be said, of romantic encounters or even attempted assaults. For Joe Kennedy, who had political ambitions for all his sons and demanded public propriety from his daughters, this behavior was intolerable. He feared scandal in the form of an out-of-wedlock pregnancy, an accusation, or even worse, public acknowledgement that one of his children was not normal. By the time Rosemary Kennedy reached her late teens, the contrast between her public image and private reality had become stark. To the world, she was a charming, soft-spoken debutante, part of the glamorous Kennedy clan, photographed in elegant gowns at London society balls or standing dutifully beside her father, Ambassador Joseph P. Kennedy Sr. But within the family's carefully curated image of perfection, Rosemary was actually slipping further and further into crisis. I must add that in the 1930s, a woman exhibiting signs of emotional instability or sexual independence was not met with compassion, but with suspicion and social censure. Intellectual disability was poorly understood and often conflated with moral weakness or psychiatric illness. Women who deviated from strict expectations could be institutionalized for behavior that today would be considered neurodivergent, hormonal, or simply human. In family letters from this time, Rosemary's mother described her daughter's behavior in coded terms: difficult, excitable, in need of guidance. She once wrote, "She is not quite like the others." But it was Joe who took action. Decisive, secretive, and ultimately devastating action. He probably acted in secret because he knew how vile and wrong it was. Fearing that Rosemary's behavior could derail the political futures of Joe Jr., John, and Robert, He began consulting physicians about ways to control her. The result would be a decision cloaked in misguided paternalism and selfish desperation. He chose to have his daughter lobotomized, a crude and untested procedure, then being hailed as a miracle cure for emotional instability. Rosemary never consented to it. Neither did her mother. In 1941, without telling his wife, Joseph Kennedy Sr. arranged for the operation, hoping it would render Rosemary calmer, more manageable, more presentable. In other words, he hoped to curb his daughter's budding sexual curiosity and avoid public shame. But instead of control, it ushered in catastrophe. The procedure was still new and poorly understood. Introduced in the US just a few years earlier by neurologist Dr. Walter Freeman and neurosurgeon Dr. James Watts, the lobotomy was promoted as a miracle solution to mental illness. Its advocates claimed it could calm patients, subdue violent impulses, and restore docility. The medical community hailed it as a breakthrough, though in practice, it often left patients with diminished personalities, cognitive damage, or worse. Joe Kennedy, obsessed with preserving the image of his family as flawless, powerful, and destined for greatness, saw the lobotomy as a discreet solution. Rosemary's increasingly visible struggles, her wandering, her tantrums, her unpredictable moods, were becoming a political liability. Her brothers were on the cusp of public life. Joe Jr. was preparing for military service. Jack was stepping into the political arena. Rosemary's behavior could not be explained away much longer. Without consulting his wife, Rose, or informing the rest of the family, Joe arranged the surgery in secret. The operation took place at a facility in upstate New York. Rosemary, unaware of what was about to happen, was told she was undergoing a procedure that would help her feel better, help her fit in. What was actually going to be done to her was never explained. The method was crude and brutal. Dr. Freeman and Dr. Watts inserted metal instruments into Rosemary's brain through small holes drilled in her skull, then severed the connections between the prefrontal cortex and the rest of the brain. She was awake during part of the operation, asked to recite the Lord's Prayer and sing songs so the surgeons could gauge her lucidity. When she began to falter, when her words slurred and finally stopped, the doctors knew they had cut too far. The results were tragic and irreversible. Rosemary emerged from the lobotomy permanently incapacitated. She could no longer speak intelligibly. She was unable to walk without assistance. Her once bright eyes now stared vacantly. The surgery that was supposed to make her more manageable had instead robbed her of basic human faculties, one of the most horrific violations that can be done to a person. Joseph Kennedy, horrified by the outcome but unwilling to admit fault, had Rosemary quietly institutionalized. She was sent first to Craig House, a private asylum, and later to St. Coletta's, a care facility for people with developmental disabilities in rural Wisconsin. From then on, her name was rarely spoken in the Kennedy household. Rose and the children were told not to visit, and they largely complied. For 2 decades, her siblings were not told the full truth about what had happened. For years, the public was led to believe that Rosemary was working as a teacher or living a quiet life elsewhere. Her existence was erased from the Kennedy narrative. It wasn't until the 1960s, after Joe Kennedy suffered a debilitating stroke, that the silence began to lift. Rose Kennedy was reportedly furious upon discovering the lobotomy had taken place without her knowledge 20 years ago. From that point on, she took charge of her daughter's care and began visiting her regularly. especially after Joseph Kennedy Sr. was left unable to communicate following his stroke. His disability was a small step toward justice, though far from sufficient. Eunice Kennedy Shriver, Rosemary's younger sister, became her fiercest advocate, and her work would eventually lead to the founding of the Special Olympics, a movement inspired in large part by Rosemary's experience and by countless others like her. But Rosemary's own life remained shrouded in the fog of what had been taken from her. Up until her death, she was long forgotten by the public that had once photographed her as a debutante in a white gown. In her final decades, she was reunited with some of her siblings, especially Eunice and Ted Kennedy, who visited often. But the vibrant young woman who had once danced at embassy balls and longed to be seen and understood had been reduced to a tragic symbol of a society that punished difference with silence and mutilation. After years of near-total isolation, Rosemary slowly re-entered the public narrative of the Kennedy family. Though she remained severely disabled, she was able to recognize family members, smile, and respond to familiar stimuli. She even relearned basic skills like walking with assistance. By the 1970s and 1980s, the Kennedys began acknowledging Rosemary's existence more openly. She occasionally appeared at family events under careful supervision. Her presence was no longer a source of shame, but a symbol of the family's growing commitment to advocacy. Rosemary lived at St. Coletta's until her death on January 7, 2005, at the age of 86. She was buried near her parents in Hollywood Cemetery in Brookline, Massachusetts. Though Rosemary Kennedy spent most of her life away from the public eye, her story quietly reshaped how the world thinks about intellectual disability, dignity, and inclusion. Her legacy is not one of political power or public speeches, but of transformation born from pain, rippling outward through the work of her siblings, especially her younger sister, Eunice Kennedy Shriver. She had grown up watching Rosemary struggle in silence and then disappear altogether. As Eunice became increasingly involved in social causes, she began to speak out about the injustice of how people like her sister were treated, not just in institutions, but by society at large. In the 1960s, she broke the family silence, writing openly about Rosemary's condition and pushing the Kennedys to acknowledge her publicly. In 1962, Eunice wrote a groundbreaking piece in the Saturday Evening Post that revealed, for the first time, that a member of the Kennedy family had an intellectual disability. It was a seismic moment. From that point on, Rosemary was no longer a secret. She became a symbol, not of shame, but of change. This act of courage laid the foundation for the Special Olympics, which Eunice founded in 1968, designed to empower individuals with intellectual and physical disabilities through sport. The movement was built on the principle that every person, regardless of ability, deserves dignity, joy, and opportunity. Rosemary, though not present on its front lines, was the soul of that mission. Beyond the Special Olympics, Rosemary's story helped catalyze a broader disability rights movement in the United States. In the years that followed, there was increased investment in special education, the creation of advocacy organizations, and eventually the passage of landmark legislation such as the Americans with Disabilities Act, ADA, in 1990. Though Rosemary's name isn't in the bill's text, her life helped create the empathy and awareness that made such laws possible. Ted Kennedy, her brother as a U.S. Senator, championed disability rights legislation with a deeply personal conviction. often citing the importance of giving a voice to those who had been ignored. Maria Shriver, Eunice's daughter, continued her mother's advocacy, using media and philanthropy to keep the conversation alive. When Rosemary Kennedy died in 2005, she was remembered not as a forgotten daughter, but as a symbol of resilience and reform. Her obituary ran in major newspapers around the world, not because of what she said or did, but because of what her silence helped uncover. She had once been hidden to protect a family's political future, but in the end, her legacy was louder than the silence that once engulfed her. To call Rosemary Kennedy's story a tragedy is to understate the profound injustice done to her. Behind the carefully polished facade of one of America's most powerful families stood a young woman whose vulnerability was met not with compassion, but with secrecy and fear. Her voice was silenced, first by a brutal procedure, then by decades of erasure. Her story is a disturbing reminder of how society once punished those who did not conform, treating difference as something to be hidden or fixed. Yet, from that silence emerged something enduring. Through the tireless advocacy of her sister Eunice and others moved by Rosemary's fate, her life became the catalyst for a global movement of inclusion, dignity, and hope. Her legacy lives on in the joyful triumphs of Special Olympics athletes, in classrooms that celebrate neurodiversity, and in the legal protections that now affirm the rights of people with disabilities. Rosemary never sought recognition, but in the end, her life, though diminished by others' choices, illuminated a path forward. Remembering her calls us to confront the hidden stories around us, to question the systems that marginalize, and to ensure that silence is never the only fate offered to those who struggle. She was once cast aside, but in truth, she changed the world.